What's up guys, LL here once again. This time I'm doing a little bit of a different sort of video. Instead of, doing the normal standard Showdown Live that has become a staple on competitive channels, I'm gonna do a little bit of a discussion of my own about the recent updates to the viability rankings, and I just want, in this first video to go to the viability rankings on screen so that, people who just aren't very familiar with the forums can find them really easily. It's usually one of the top, 2 to 3 threads up here in terms of the pins because of how active it is. There was a ranking update recently, I believe it was on page 61. I don't know, I saw the ranking updates on Discord, but I haven't actually seen what updated, so I'm gonna be giving my thoughts this time around when I find it. Okay, so here is the ranking update. Okay, now I just want to give my thoughts on it and some things that I think should have happened that didn't. So first of all, the A to A+ rise for Magirna, that is totally justified. Assault Vest Magirna is one of the only safe checks to Protean Ninja in the tier. It's a really solid blanket check to things. With Mega Metagross gone, Tapu Lele is going to be a bit more prominent, so obviously it can be really solid with AV. But aside from just extending past its AV set, its offensive Trick Room set can be an absolute disaster for offensive teams to deal with. It can OHKO most offensive mons with whatever Z move, with Z Fluid Cannon or Twinkle Tackle, however you want to say it. And if you want to lure in something like Magirna if you want to lure in a Celesteela for, say, a Pinsir that you have on your team, you can run Gigavolt Havoc on your Trick Room set and do great. And it has the versatility to run several different sets, so I can definitely see why it's an A+. When I see a Magirna team preview, I immediately look at the team. You can thing is, you can usually tell whether or not a Magirna is running something like Shift Gear, or you can't really tell whether it's running Shift Gear or OTR unless it's extremely obvious that it's a Trick Room and that it's gonna be Trick Room. But you can usually tell if it's AV or not, because if it's AV, then usually they won't have many good backup checks for things like Tapu Lele and Greninja that Magirna kind of has to check. If their only Greninja check is Magirna, obviously it's going to be Assault Vest just to do a better job at it. But it's overall a really good mon, definitely deserving of the rise, amazing typing. And, aside from Tapu Lele usage decreasing, Pinsir usage is increasing, so while bulky Magirna can, isn't a very steady, I guess you'd say, Pinsir check, it can still check Pinsir, decently well, because it eats a +2 Earthquake, and then OHKO's back with Thunderbolt, I believe, if it's max special attack modest. And obviously, it's not a hard counter to Pinsir, but the fact that it just checks something that's so threatening, especially with NJNP Web's offense gaining and being as popular as it is, Mega Heracross at A-. I might have put in A, but I can definitely understand A-. Seems like a reasonable ranking for Mega Heracross. Pretty much 6-0's Sari's Trick Room team by itself, which is huge. If you don't know Sari's Trick Room team, it's the Uxie, Alolan Marowak, Magirna, Cresselia, Crawdaunt, and one other mon I'm forgetting, that Trick Room team that's been floating around recently. And it's, Mega Heracross does a great job dismantling that, so the fact that that team was so common is nice for Heracross. Also, Mega Heracross can do really well versus common BP teams just because it can pin missile incoming psychics that want to try setting up calm minds or stored powers or whatever. I believe Necrozma needs to have an Iron Defense up in order to be able to take on Heracross first. It has to have an Iron Defense up as Heracross comes in, so that's pretty big. Baton Pass is still a stupid strategy. There are things like Magirna that can switch into Heracross, and there's adapted versions of BP out there that you can use that don't get raffle stomped by Heracross, but it's overall a mon that like dismantles a ton of common meta trends. If you want to look at like its matchup versus stall, like obviously it doesn't 6-0 stall like it did with versus some teams last gen. Like Unaware Clefable can eat up hits from it, and while it does get pressured by Rock Blast crits, which are pretty common, it can is probably one of the most like safe checks to it. If you've got Heracross like with a rocking with a rock setting Mon that sets rocks on Sableye and doesn't just immediately get defogged on by Skarm, you can pretty easily like, what would you say? You can pretty easily like pressure Clef into a position where it can't quite check Hera as well. But, you know, you have to do a good job playing versus it as well. I mean, obviously it doesn't 6-0, as I said earlier. Also, a lot of stalls run things like Zapdos. Doug Trio's probably going to start running Aerial Ace more often because stall runs Sash Doug Trio more often than offense does. Although I believe Ground DMZ is the best set personally, just because of what it traps. You can also run like Fly DMZ with Aerial Ace if you're that desperate to deal with Heracross, but I don't think it's that big a deal because you got things like, you know, you got counter Skarmory with Sturdy. It started running Whirlwind a bit more lately, I think, and I think Heracross is a good matchup versus like Stall, Trick Room, and Wet and Baton Pass, which were three of the like biggest play styles when it entered the tier. So I think, I mean, A- might be a bit low for it, but I can definitely understand like why it's not as good as it was before, because, you know, like things like, you know, it's like got the low speed, which leaves it liable to being outsped by a bunch of offensive threats like, oh, sorry, I meant to, why did I go down so far? Yeah, I must have hit the key or whatever. It leaves it to being liable to be outsped by stuff like Tapu Lele and Latios Latios is picking up a lot of steam. The rising T-Tar usage helps Heracross as well because it obviously doesn't like eating banded stone edges, but anything that can take, you know, strong dark attacks is appreciated whenever T-Tar is rising in usage. T-Tar is one of those mons, like, this happened in Oris as well, like, it doesn't seem that good starting out, but it slowly gains usage until it becomes really prominent. Like, in the beginning of Oris, like, T-Tar wasn't used nearly as much as it was at the end. At the end of Oris, it's like A+ in the VR. Band set is amazing. Scarf set is really good too, more consistent at trapping things like Gengar and such. And, you know, I mean, now I can understand why it's A- in this meta versus Oris. Like, there are definite differences and things that are restricting it from being better. But, you know, I think it's going to end up being better in the long run. Latios likes one of its biggest checks gone. It can spam like Psyshocks a lot more freely now. Don't get boosted by terrain because it's levitating, unfortunately. But aside from that, honestly, if Latios had a different ability, aside from adaptability, Latios would be hilarious. And also, my personal favorite set, like, I know Specs is gaining a lot of traction and is really good just because like Psyshock and Draco hitting insanely hard, but I like Gigavolt Havoc like Latios a lot because you can lure in the aforementioned Celesteela as well as just like fat steals that are neutral to like I'm pretty sure you do north of like 60-70% to Scizor, which pretty much takes it out of contention for the rest of the game if you hit like if Scizor comes trying to switch in to take one of your attacks and you just Gigavolt Havoc it on the switch, it's pretty much going to be disabled for the rest of the game. And it's not like it can take a T-Bolt from you immediately after a Giga. I mean, obviously, you know, Latios isn't amazing right now. There's a lot of fairies like Tapu Koko, Tapu Lele, Tapu Fini, Tapu Bulu, which is better after the Metagross, like ban the aforementioned Magirna, Skarmory, stuff like that that, I mean, Skarmory's not fairy, but it's just steel. Scizor, Pharaoh, stuff like that is like very common right now. And so it's a lot harder for Latios to be able to, spam Dracos like it could last gen, because last gen there's just, you know, Clef, which got hugely pressured by Spec Psyshock. Oh, and I can understand, that's not a very good answer. Like, Zoomeril also pressured by Spec Psyshock. You add Scizor, Pharaoh, Skarm, that stuff, they get bought by HP Fire. Like, you're not as restricted. Like, Magirna completely blocks Latios from doing what it wants to. Heatran takes a lot from Gigavolt Havoc, which is, a good thing. But then you got things like physically defensive Tapu Fini, which, while it isn't a hard counter to Specs Latios by any means, it does a better job staying up to it than stuff like a Azumarill that we used to have. I mean, we still have a Azumarill, but it's just not as prominent as it used to be last gen. And then there's like Tapu Koko, which, while it doesn't necessarily like deal with Latios 1v1, it can deter it from using Dracos, because you don't want to give Tapu Koko, switch initiative and then let them get some U-turn chip off on you, so you lose to the Scarf Keldeo later in the game. And Latios is definitely not as good as it was last gen, but the rise makes a ton of sense with Gross departing, Mega Heracross entering the tier as well. Mantine sucks, we don't need to talk about that. Reuni's an interesting CM sweeper that can, aside from, it's basically useless against Mega Sableye stall, but aside from that, it's bulky enough to be able to put in work versus a lot of playstyles. The one thing I have a qualm with when it comes to this thing is the prevalence of webs, because Bisharp is very common, and if you manage to, have if you're Colbur CM or something, and you knock out the Bisharp, there's also like a Z-move Mimikyu sitting in the back grade to take you out, so it's not like Reuni just sets up with ease. Ditto, I've seen P2 memeing that Ditto is broken, and it destroys BP, which honestly isn't going to be relevant because it's getting banned like any time now. It can do some interesting, if you can do some interesting shenanigans for stall with like PP stalling, and because you can go in and have like your Sableye versus their Sableye, click a recover, and just spam a couple of recovers until you're out of PP, swap out, and then come back in, just PP stall a Chansey. It's definitely got its uses. And the drops, there are only a couple. I can understand Scizor dropping, Gross is gone, so the main thing that it checks is out of the tier. I don't like Scizor that much. I haven't seen SD Scizor sweep this gen at all. Its defog set isn't bad because Volcarona is really good now, and I don't like Scizor right now, but it's well placed at A- because it does still check stuff like Tapu Lele, Rising Latios, and T-Tar that it needs to, but it's just not as good as it was last gen. Last gen it was borderline S rank. A- is good placement here because it's not as useful, I guess. There's a lot of things like Life Orb, Tapu Koko, offensive variants of Landorus. Heatran is offensive Heatran is more common this gen, so you can't run fast Scizor to outspeed Spadef and punch it in the face with superpower. Scizor just isn't as good. It's definitely still a solid choice at Omega, but oftentimes I just find myself thinking oh, why can't I run Magirna here plus a physical blanket check, or why can't I run Mega Mawile for the offensive presence? And then dropping Protean Ninja, I'm not 100% sure about that. With Gross gone, it has more flexibility in terms of move slots because it doesn't have to run Dark Pulse anymore, but I personally think that that drop was a tad bit unjustified, but in general, well, you can see that Greninja's a bit more expected now. Like with the gross leaving, as I said, Magirna usage goes up, so that's one of its most common checks. Keldeo usage has been like skyrocketing lately because Scarf Stone Edge is one of the only consistent ways to beat non-charty Volk, and even then you only have an 80% chance of beating Volk, which is pretty insane. But you know, it's like I get why it dropped, but I don't necessarily agree with it. It's definitely like it was better before Gross was banned, just because there wasn't nearly as much AV Magirna because bulky offense could just run Gross and check the same things that Magirna does aside from Gren. But overall, you know, I agree with most of this update. I'm a little salty that Zygarde didn't rise. Like, CB is an insanely strong set. Uh, I don't think something has to necessarily have like 10 really good sets to be able to be S rank like Lando is right now. Like, CB is an amazing set. I mean, the Rising Blue usage does hurt it, but I think the important thing about Zygarde to S is that not enough has really changed in the meta to warrant it rising. Like, yeah, I guess Pinsir usage has gone up, so that means it's another bug type to soft check it, but in general, like, if anything, there's been meta trends going against it, like rising usage in Tapu Bulu after the gross ban is bad for it because Tapu Bulu is one of the best checks to CB Zygarde in the first place. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and have a nice day.